3.5 magnitude earthquake gave the Castaic area quite a shake this morning. It struck at 5:42. People in Valencia seemed to feel it the most, but the USGS says it got reports from as far away as Inglewood.
The water rose early in the morning to leave parks and streets part hidden by flooding around the centre of Hereford. Yet another case study in the story of the unrelenting February storms. Here they're having to take a paramedic by boat into a stranded neighbourhood. They know all about flooding here, but rarely on this scale.
So what we're doing now is we're sending boats out to go and rescue people, which we've done since first thing this morning. So we've made approximately about 20 to 25 rescues so far.
How many of the residents have been moved out?
There's a lot of people that have been moved out. There's not very many people left, really. They've been brilliant, the emergency services, up and down constantly all day. Really, really good. Can't thank these people enough.
And so in increasingly familiar flood-induced choreography, more churches and leisure centres are turned into temporary shelters. The Environment Agency said in places the River Wye had reached its highest level since records began 200 years ago.
It's the worst I've ever seen it. Ever since I've been here, and I've been running around this place for 3 donkey's years.
In Worcestershire, police searching for a 55-year-old woman missing after being swept into floodwater by the river team said this evening they'd found a body. By mid-morning, more than 500 flood alerts and warnings covered much of England, following a record number the day before. This was the scene in Guildford in Surrey. And with more flooding came more criticism of the UK government response. Today, the Environment Minister said they were committing billions of pounds to flood defences.
The flood infrastructure that we have in place, the flood defence infrastructure, has worked as expected and has protected around 20,000 homes in this particular incident. I know that's no comfort at all, obviously, to the 400 homes that have been flooded.
So the emergency operations are continuing this evening in Hereford, but in other parts of the UK which bore the brunt of the weekend storms, it's the aftermath they're now having to deal with. Particularly in South Wales. We found business after business immersed in the wreckage of the weekend.
Bit of damage here.
Phil Thomas shows us his microbrewery, still spewing floodwater. This image from the police helicopter shows the scale of the flooding they encountered on just this one industrial estate.
I came in, walked in through the door with my wife and 2 kids, and I was in tears. I was in tears. You know, I've been here for 5 years, building up the business slowly but surely, and you know, in one evening there's £10,000 worth of damage, or perhaps more.
The First Minister of Wales, a few miles away in Pontypridd, knows there's also major infrastructure damage beyond the chaos at street level, where for some residents it's still a struggle to access their properties.
And it's just not shifting, is it?
And those who have are left in despair.
Obviously it's come up to the 6 foot on the wall and absolutely devastated.
Kerry Loveridge woke up on the sofa surrounded by water. Like others, she feels warnings could have been clearer.
Gutted, devastated and all cried out. I am angry, very angry. As you can see, we are literally going to be out of this house for, it's going to be about 6 months, if not longer.
And now here it's Plaid Cymru accusing a Labour government of underinvestment in flood defences. Some are asking questions about whether your government has got a grip on this issue.
Well, no government could have predicted what happened here over the weekend. This government will spend £350 million in this Assembly term alone on flood defences in Wales.
Back in Hereford, the flood levels are now slowly receding. But in neighbouring Worcestershire, the threat of rising water remains as we enter yet another night of people being told to leave their homes.
Climate is demanding urgent action on the edge of the village where pastures are no longer fit for purpose.
They're so mucky and they've just run right out of food and they've stored it all into the ground.
If you left the sheep on the field, they
just die, and you've got to look after them, haven't they? They were our livelihoods. We never had it like this before. Well, never seen it like this before.
This morning, with whole neighborhoods underwater, much of central Mississippi remains under flash flood watch, with storms moving in, bringing as much as 2 inches of rain. All of it eventually expected to flow downstream. South of Jackson in Marion County, a desperate rush to get ready. For many, it's already too late. It's a similar scene in the state capital, Jackson, where the Mississippi Department of Wildlife is on patrol at the height of the flood, using these boats to go door to door. How many people did you have to rescue in this neighborhood?
6 people were evacuated from this neighborhood.
Now, the eyes and ears for anxious homeowners.
It looks like it may have gotten over the front door threshold, so she may have a couple inches of water.
Janet Harris is desperate for a glimpse of her house.
It's just mind-blowing. It's like, it's unbelievable.
In parts of Jackson, Mississippi, there is water everywhere.
You feel helpless and you want to throw in the towel.
With the worst flooding in decades affecting thousands across central Mississippi, this morning they're bracing for more rain, with another 2 inches expected over the next few days. Across parts of Jackson, the swollen Pearl River, relentless, overtaking homes, shutting down streets, and flowing through bridges.
We got a lot of people hurting.
Governor Tate Reeves says the state will feel the impact of this for years.
The fact is, whether it's 6 inches or 6 feet, it doesn't really matter. When you have this kind of water in your homes, it can really disrupt your lives.
It's something Patrick Cruz knows firsthand.
This whole bottom level is out, and this is, one of many homes. Just the sheer force of, millions of gallons of water. I mean, there's nothing you can do. If it wants in, it's coming in.
A few streets away, for this young family,
I'm about to load them up on my back, walk them in, go back and get my wife and 8-week-old. Don't let go.
There's only one way to get to their home. Across parts of the South, 10 million people are under flood warnings across 15 states, including Tennessee, where wide stretches of Hardin County are submerged. Back in Jackson, this anxious father knows it's only a matter of time before the water creeps in. But the one silver lining, an outpouring of love.
It's really been overwhelming. I mean, really just kind of thinking about it, I get kind of broken up over it because it's such a good feeling to have so many friends and family that are helping out.
The state of emergency in Mississippi, parts of the state facing the worst flooding in 37 years. One of several waterlogged states in the South. A home pulled off its foundation and washed into the river, part of a landslide in Savannah, Tennessee. And part of Jackson, Mississippi, look at this, underwater, the Pearl River at major flood stages and still rising. Here's ABC senior meteorologist Rob Marciano.
Tonight, relentless rain causing more river flooding and major damage across the South. Dramatic video capturing this Tennessee home collapsing after a massive landslide. Watch again, you can see sparks flying as the house plunges down a steep bank into the Tennessee River Saturday night. A second home also destroyed. Fortunately, no one was hurt. In neighboring Mississippi, residents there bracing for catastrophic flooding as the Pearl River continues to rise after weeks of rain.
Violent and fast-moving storm has hit Sydney overnight, ripping off roofs, cutting power to thousands and claiming the life of a man at the Rocks. Damage is widespread across the city and it's impacting the morning commute. In a moment, we'll speak to SES Assistant Commissioner Paul Bailey, but first to today's Gabrielle Boyle in the city's north. Gabby, just how much damage was caused?
Yeah, good morning, Tracy. Well, the scene behind me here at the Terry Hills Par 3 golf course really sums up the strength of that storm that ripped through Sydney last night. Take a look at this. The roof of the golf club has been completely ripped off, peeled off. They've described it like a kite flying through the air and landing on the ground here in the car park. You've got twisted metal, wood, insulation. It's been spread right throughout the sides of the golf course as well. Just an absolute mess. Last night, late last night, that storm tore through, bringing extreme lightning, thunder, certainly plenty of rain and very, very strong winds. Right throughout Sydney, you can see the remnants of that because we've got trees down, branches down, damage to buildings and cars. It is going to be a very big clean-up job. And, of course, it brought that tragic news as well. A 37-year-old man who was walking in the Rocks, struck by a flying gas bottle carried by those incredible winds, struck in the head. He was raced to St Vincent's Hospital, but tragically his life could not be saved. An extraordinary storm and a terrible outcome there, Tracy.
They're learning how to put on protective clothing and spray pesticide properly. Around 600 Kenyan Army cadets have been called up to help fight the onslaught of locusts.
We target to spray hoppers, which have just hatched in about 2-3 weeks ago. So ground spray for the hoppers is the recommended way of controlling them.
The new phase, targeting the insect's offspring, comes after days of aerial spraying. The current locust invasion is seriously threatening crop production. It's worsening food shortages in a region where up to 25 million people are already suffering from 3 consecutive years of droughts and floods. Several countries in the Horn of Africa have been hit, with South Sudan becoming the latest victim as these yellow grasshoppers continue to expand their breeding grounds. South Sudan and Uganda are particularly vulnerable and underprepared to stop the spread.
Both countries haven't seen swarms since 1961, so it's very difficult to quickly respond and upscale those much-needed control efforts in order to protect the livelihoods and the food security of people in the Horn of Africa.
More than 60% of the population in South Sudan is already facing critical lack of food following years of civil war. Local authorities as well as the United Nations have called for urgent action, asking for speedy financial assistance to curb the outbreak. Some experts have warned that there could be 500 times more by the end of June.
Ongoing plague of desert locusts is devastating crops in East Africa. The insects are the most dangerous of all migratory pests. Swarms have spread through Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania, Eritrea and Djibouti. And on Tuesday, some crossed back into Uganda after having briefly entered South Sudan. Now, the invasion poses a serious threat to food security in a region where up to 25 million people are already struggling to get enough to eat after 3 years of drought, floods, and in South Sudan's case, at least, civil war. Well, Keith Cressman.
On coronavirus, the number of infected people around the world right now stands at more than 77,000.
That's right. And right here in the U.S., there are 34 confirmed cases, and the CDC is warning Americans that this contagion represents a tremendous public health threat. NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar is here with more. Thank you, Dr. Natalie, for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
What do you make of this uptick? How concerned should Americans be about
Well, Kristen, we've certainly anticipated that we're going to have more cases in the U.S. And while the threat of a global pandemic is definitely real, and it is a public health importance in this country, officials here are still maintaining that the risk to the general public is, in fact, still very low.
How prepared are health and government officials for this coronavirus? I mean, that's the real concern, right?
That's the real
we being
concern.
sufficiently protected?
Correct. So, Peter, the CDC is actively reviewing its global pandemic preparedness, and it's communicating very directly with health, care systems and hospitals and communities in this country. So hospital preparedness is incredibly important, and that includes reinforcing infection control procedures, making sure that hospitals are prepared for an influx of patients, and making sure that healthcare workers have adequate supplies. Additionally, more on the frontier, if you will, there are airport screenings that are in place. There is voluntary self-quarantine for people who have traveled from China, and there are also 20 CDC quarantine stations throughout the country that are prepared to handle cases.
Well, this is a new spread. That's one of the challenges, a new strain, yes, I should say. And so health officials are still trying to figure out exactly how it's spread.
Right.
What do they know about that?
Well, what was interesting this week, Kristen, is that there was a report in the New England Journal of Medicine, again, about this concept of asymptomatic transmission. And they did, in fact, find that virus was detectable in the respiratory secretions of people before they were displaying symptoms. But I will quote Dr. Fauci in reinforcing the idea that asymptomatic transmission is not what typically drives epidemics. So while there is still a virus that's detectable, we don't know exactly how contagious that is in an asymptomatic individual. Conventionally, traditionally, when we talk about infectious diseases, the more symptomatic an individual is, that's the time when bacteria or viruses are more evident and are more likely to be transmitted.
Health officials seem to think it is only a matter of time until the coronavirus starts to spread through communities here in the United States. The Centers for Disease Control says it is preparing medical personnel on how to contain the spread of its flu-like illness. So far, 34 coronavirus cases have been confirmed in the U.S., but there have been more than 76,000 worldwide, the vast majority in China. And overnight, there was a huge surge of cases in South Korea. More than 2,200 people around the world have died. Deborah Pata is in Tokyo, where the disease is now threatening the 2020 Olympics, which are still months away.
Good morning. Japan has been at pains to stress that the Summer Olympics will not be disrupted by the coronavirus outbreak, but they've come under fire for mismanaging the quarantine on the Diamond Princess. Japan has already invested more than $28 billion in infrastructure for the Olympics, and there's around $6 billion in sponsorship at stake. Olympic officials insist the Games will not be cancelled or postponed, but experts point out that the government doesn't have a plan B if the virus continues to spread in this country, other than to cross their fingers and hope it abates in time for the Olympics in July. Their handling of the quarantine process on the now notorious Diamond Princess has done little to restore public confidence in their crisis management ability. And the ship has become the site of the largest cluster of infections outside China.
This plane brought Taiwanese evacuees home from a quarantined cruise ship in Japan hit by the coronavirus. While their plane and all luggage gets a thorough disinfection, the evacuees will be isolated for another 2 weeks. These precautions are the new normal in the fight to contain the coronavirus. In Italy, top officials meet after the virus claimed its first victim in the country. An elderly man in northern Italy died after being hospitalized. The number of cases spiked to 17 in just one day. In Codogno, a town southeast of Milan, officials shut down schools and businesses.
They've issued an official order to close down all the shops, and we're following the order, so we're closing. There's a lot of alarm, and that also worries me.
We are old and very concerned. I am 76 years old. I live on my own. I really don't know what to do.
Public events are banned, and that includes church services. The first patient to contract the virus here had met a friend who had recently travelled to China. But the World Health Organization is worried about another trend they have spotted in the latest infections.
Although the total number of cases outside China remains relatively small, we're concerned about the number of cases with no clear epidemiological link, such as travel history to China or contact with a confirmed case.
In Ukraine, local residents blocked buses with passengers evacuated from China. These scenes prompted President Zelensky to give his fellow citizens a dressing down on television.
These are our Ukrainians. They're not sick with plague. They don't have horns and hooves. They are ordinary, normal people.
He promised that the organisers of the blockade would be prosecuted. Authorities are working to contain the fear of the virus as well as its spread.
For more, I'm joined by virologist Martin Sturmer in Frankfurt. Professor Sturmer, thanks for joining me. The Director General of the WHO, as we just heard in that report, has said they're concerned about some new cases that may not have a link to China. A second person has just died now in Italy. How worried should we be?
We should be worried about these cases because they make it more difficult to control the spread of the virus. The reason is they do not fit into our case definition, and therefore they might not be tested or maybe tested delayed, so they can spread the virus in an uncontrolled way.
The WHO has also warned that the window of opportunity to contain this epidemic is closing. What should governments around the world be doing?
Yeah, we heard about Italy, so they do quite restrictive measures, and that might be one way to be alarmed or be aware in controlling the virus or the spread of the virus, and even be more careful in looking into the traffic from and to China, and making people coming from China, making them more aware to look at themselves, to do not go out and go to a festival or somewhere else. And if I come back from China, please stay at home for 14 days and be sure that you do not get ill and carry the virus somewhere else.
And what about in China? I mean, are there signs that the outbreak there has peaked?
Just looking at the numbers they report, it might be. However, they've changed their case definition 3 times in 8 days. So it's very difficult to rely if this is a true numbers of people carrying the virus. So I'm not sure whether this is a peak.
Is there a vaccination for this virus within reach?
They are working on it, but I would expect it at least in June to July, and even then it has to be tested in a small number of patients before you can use it widely. So it's difficult. I would not expect it in the next weeks or month.
Right. And how likely then is it that this epidemic is going to be labelled a pandemic?
It depends on how the situation in Italy might change. Actually, we heard about 17 cases. If they are not able to control the spread of the virus, then we have the definition for a pandemic.
1 month after Wuhan sealed off its borders, its roads are empty and construction sites are abandoned. The city's millions of residents have been ordered to stay indoors. Among them, Mark Leo and his son.
Clap your hands, stomp your feet.
Clap your hands, stomp your feet.
With schools across China closed until further notice, Ethan is taking classes online. Through a video call, Mark told us his family was doing its best to adapt to life under lockdown.
And how have you been coping with the restrictions?
I think the lockdown is necessary. Friends of people I know and some of my colleagues have been infected, and some died a few days after they found out they caught the virus. So I'm really worried for my family. All we can do is to stay at home.
Residents had been permitted to leave their residential compounds once every 7 days. But this week, loudspeakers placed on street corners notified households of a change.
From now on, nobody can go out. The previous allowance for going out every 7 days has been cancelled.
Lining up to collect food at local pickup points is now for many the only outing for the day. Special teams have been deployed to deliver supplies. They're among the few still permitted to drive around the city. Cici Zhu is one of them.
Every day I'm in contact with those who live in my community. I need to know how many people live in one household and check the temperature twice a day.
Cici says food distribution in Wuhan has improved since the beginning of the lockdown, and most people seem to support the new measures.
By sealing off the community, we can isolate the unhealthy people from healthy people. Our strategy now is early detection and early isolation.
A makeshift hospital nicknamed the Wuhan Living Room has become home for thousands infected by the virus. Those who don't come voluntarily are brought by force. Mark Leo knows the coronavirus crisis will eventually pass, but worries about the stigma Wuhan residents may endure.
The virus originated in Wuhan, but Wuhan people didn't create it. I hope they don't keep a bias against us. They shouldn't blame everything on Wuhan people.
So far, 7-year-old Ethan isn't too worried. His wish, for now, is being allowed again to play outside.
Shutters are down in Codogna's town centre. This supermarket says it's closed due to a regional order, banning public gatherings because of a coronavirus scare.
The decree demanded all commercial activities be suspended, so we're following that order. We're closing up shop.
I think wearing a mask is the right thing to do, but there's too much panic. Shutting down the streets is going too far.
The town in Lombardy, with 15,000 inhabitants, was the first among a handful of communities to be placed under lockdown in northern Italy.
The U.S. and the Taliban appear to be on the verge of signing a historic peace deal that could finally end the 18-year war. A temporary week-long truce is set to begin within hours. The agreement calls for a reduction of violence across Afghanistan. The U.S. and the Taliban are set to sign a historic peace deal a week from Saturday on February 29th, as long as the group holds back attacks. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata. He's following the latest from London. So, Charlie, do we really expect the Taliban to hold to this reduction of violence truce when the U.S. has been demanding that for years?
Well, Vlad, you know, that's the key question. And I think the hint is in the title there, the reduction of violence. Nobody's calling it a ceasefire. Nobody's calling it a truce, because those things can be broken. Reduction of violence is more subjective. You know, it's toning down some of the violence that we've seen. It's worth mentioning we are not in the so-called fighting season. It's the winter time in parts of Afghanistan, well, in all of Afghanistan, but that means that there's already a reduction in violence. But the Taliban are taking it seriously. They put out a WhatsApp message saying to all their sort of local commanders to tell their fighters that this means what it means. We need to stop this. There will be no fighting. There will be no roadside bombs. There won't be attacks on civilians. Certainly won't be attacks on U.S. troops. And this has to hold for a 7-day period. Can we trust the Taliban? Not sure. There are skeptics that say that this won't happen, that we can't trust them. Are there going to be spoilers? Will there be a moderate, tolerated level of violence, as sometimes happens during these times, the people that aren't part of this deal that just want to be the spoilers? That will be taken into account. But they are taking it seriously. And there is reason to hope. I suppose this is one of probably the most hopeful period that we're headed into for one particular reason, because the Taliban want U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and President Trump wants U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. That's a good starting position.
France 24's Marius Office reports.
Demonstrators advancing calmly through the streets of Algiers on Friday, a continuation of the peaceful protests that began a year ago to the day. Protesters' key demand: the departure of Algeria's current leadership that came into power in December.
It's very surprising that soldiers haven't been deployed onto the streets. I pay my respects to the previous army chief, because if he wanted to end the movement, he could have done it in 48 hours.
During the march, demonstrators tried to reach the Algerian capital's main post office, a symbolic meeting place for their movement. Roadblocks, however, prevented them from approaching it. The same scenes and slogans fill the streets of all the country's largest cities. Now, though, protesters have one priority: to not let the protest movement lose momentum after Friday's one-year anniversary. While some want it to become a legitimate opposition to Algeria's leadership, President Tebboune has extended an olive branch to protesters, some of whom could be tempted to step back from the movement.
It's a radical overhaul to the UK's immigration system. Following the Brexit transition period, the British government plans to end the EU's free movement policy, prioritising high-skilled workers through a points-based system, with no exceptions for European citizens.
So this is a single global immigration system. Doesn't discriminate in terms of where you've come from or which country you originate from. But importantly, it's about the skills that you can bring to the UK. So as a result, numbers will come down. That is the purpose of having a system where we're not getting into the sphere of targets at all.
Points will be granted based on specific skills, including qualifications, salaries, and standard of English. And visas will only be given to people who pass a certain ceiling. But business groups warn there's already a shortage of labour, and that the new rules could lead to a deficit of staff in care, construction and hospitality industries.